Okay, so today we're going to look at something pretty fundamental, I think, how work, gender, and family life kind of all intersect,
Yeah,
especially in the US, and especially, in this kind of weird period we've been in between, say, 2021 and 2023, coming right out of those big disruptions from the pandemic.
right.
And you've actually shared some really interesting data with me, a way to kind of visualize how these things are all playing out.
Yeah,
And I think it's going to lead to some pretty surprising insights.
awesome. Are
Yeah.
you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
It feels like we've all been going through some really big changes these last few years in terms of, work and how we think about family, especially since the pandemic.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
this time, the stuff you send over, it gives us like a really interesting snapshot of all that, a way to see how those two things connect, like what you do for a living and whether you start a family.
It's a really fascinating look, and specifically we're going to be diving into the scatter plot. It's called Occupation Proportion Female and Female Workers Birth Rate, US 2021 to 2023.
Okay.
And it's based on data from the American Community Survey. P. N. Cohen did this analysis, and you can find it on ipums.org.
Okay.
So basically, picture this, right? You've got this map of different jobs, okay? Each job is a bubble. And where that bubble is placed, like left or right, tells you how many women are in that job, what percentage, and then how high up it is that shows the birth rate for the women in that job.
Gotcha.
And the bigger the bubble, the more people are doing that job. And then there's this line running through it all. It's called a weighted median split. And it basically shows you the overall trend, which way all these bubbles are leaning.
Okay, so I think for anyone listening, our mission today is to really get to the bottom of this visual, right? Pull out the patterns and see what they tell us about what it's like for women who work and, what it says about our society as a whole.
Exactly.
So when you look at this thing, what jumps out at you first?
Well, the first thing you notice is that upward scope on that weighted median spline.
Okay.
Basically, what that tells us is that in general, as the number of women in a job goes up, so does the birth rate for those women.
That kind of makes sense, right? Like it fits with what we might expect.
Yeah, it does seem to align with some of our assumptions.
But let's get into the nitty-gritty. Can you give us some real-world examples of those jobs where we see lots of women and, higher birth rates?
Definitely. So we're talking about fields like registered nurses, elementary and middle school teachers, secretaries and administrative assistants, and even folks in food service like waitresses.
Uh-huh.
In all of these jobs, you've got over 80% women, and their birth rates are somewhere between like 0.06 and 0.09 births per year.
Interesting. And those jobs, do they have something in common?
They do. They all have this element of, caring for others or teaching or service roles.
Right, right.
So it's probably not just a coincidence, right? It suggests that maybe those jobs offer something, like more predictable hours, maybe a culture that's more understanding about family stuff that helps women balance work and family.
Like teachers having summers off.
Exactly.
Now, you were saying that it's not like a perfectly neat picture, even within these female-dominated areas.
Right.
So where do things get a bit more nuanced?
Well, take occupations where more than 90% of the workforce is female, like personal appearance workers, hairdressers, cosmetologists, and also nurse practitioners. They actually have slightly lower birth rates, somewhere between 0.03 and 0.06.
Huh. That's interesting. It's still like super female-dominated. What do you think is going on there?
Could be a few things. I mean, personal appearance work, you're often working really irregular hours, you're on your feet all day, and the income can be kind of unstable.
Yeah.
And nurse practitioners, even though they're in healthcare, they often have a ton of autonomy and responsibility, which can lead to some really demanding and unpredictable schedules, pretty different from a registered nurse who might have more structured shifts.
So we're seeing this connection between, Lots of women in a job and higher birth rates, but with some exceptions that make you think.
Yeah, definitely.
So what happens when we look at the flip side, those jobs where it's mostly men?
Right. Well, in those fields, there are only a few women, and generally speaking, they have lower birth rates. So think about jobs like laborers and movers or protective service workers. Very few women, and birth rates tend to be around 0.03 or even less.
That kind of fits the image we have, right?
It does, doesn't it?
Those jobs are physically tough, and maybe the workplace culture hasn't really been set up to support women and families.
Could be the physical nature of the work itself, or maybe it's that in a male-dominated field, things like flexible schedules or good parental leave policies just haven't been prioritized for women.
Okay, now, I know you mentioned a couple of outliers that really caught your eye.
Oh, yeah.
And this is where it gets juicy. Tell us about the telemarketers.
Oh, the telemarketers, they're a fascinating case.
Okay.
They have a lot of women working there, around 80%, but their birth rate is really high, like 0.12, way higher than a lot of other fields with similar or even more women.
Wow, that is surprising. Telemarketing doesn't exactly scream family-friendly, right? What do you think is going on there?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One possibility is the flexibility that a lot of those jobs offer. Maybe you can work remotely. Maybe you can control your schedule more than in a typical office job or in the service industry. Plus, it's not physically demanding, so maybe that flexibility helps women who are also taking care of kids.
Right, so it's not just about being flexible, it's about the kind of flexibility.
Exactly.
Okay, what about that other outlier you mentioned?
Optometrists.
Right.
They have a much more even split between men and women, like 50-50, but their birth rate is super low, almost 0.03.
Huh, that's almost the opposite of what we expect, especially compared to those female-dominated fields with much higher birth rates. Any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, it really makes you think about what it takes to be an optometrist, right? It's a lot of schooling, and a lot of them run their own practices or work in places with really demanding patient schedules that are hard to change. Plus, you often spend years studying and building your practice before even thinking about starting a family. So it shows that it's not just about having lots of women in a job. The type of work and the whole career path matter too.
It's complicated.
It is.
Okay, so we're seeing these patterns and also where they don't quite hold up. But now let's put on our gender lenses here. How might men and women experience these trends differently in all these different fields?
Right.
Let's start with women. What's it like for them?
Well, for women in those female-dominated fields like nursing and teaching, as we said, there might be some flexibility that helps with family, but we can't forget that those jobs have historically been paid less than a lot of male-dominated jobs, even when they need the same level of education and skill.
Right.
That can put a real strain on families, especially when you're just starting out or trying to raise kids. And there's also the societal pressure, right? The expectation that women in these caring roles are just naturally more likely to focus on family.
It's like they're making a trade-off.
Exactly.
So what about women who are working in those male-dominated fields we talked about, like protective services?
For them, it could be a very different story. They might not have good maternity leave options. They might have really rigid schedules that make finding childcare a nightmare. And the whole workplace culture might not be very supportive of family responsibilities.
Right.
All those things could definitely be contributing to those lower birth rates we see.
Now, all the data we have focuses on women's birth rates. But men are a part of the family equation too, right? So even though we don't have specific numbers on male birth rates by occupation, what can we guess about how men see all of this?
That's a huge question, and it's true that not having that male data in this particular study is a real gap in our understanding, but we can still speculate a little, right?
Sure.
So for men who are working in those female-dominated fields where they're in the minority, they might run into those stereotypes about masculinity, that could consciously or unconsciously affect their own choices about family or their partner's choices.
It's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that angle.
Yeah, and what about men in those more traditional male-dominated jobs? Well, they might, on average, be earning more money, which could influence their partner's decisions about having kids. But they might also have less flexibility themselves, which could put more pressure on their partners to handle childcare and all that. So until we have more data about men's fertility patterns linked to their jobs and how many women are in those jobs, we're only getting part of the picture.
Okay, so to sum it all up, we're seeing this interesting link where having more women in a job often means higher birth rates for those women, especially in jobs where there's more flexibility or that fit those traditional ideas about women's roles.
Yeah.
And on the other side, in those male-dominated or super-demanding jobs, we tend to see lower birth rates for women. And those outliers, the telemarketers and the optometrists, they really highlight that it's not so straightforward. Things like the type of flexibility you have and just the nature of the job itself. Those things matter a lot.
Absolutely. And this snapshot from 2021 to 2023 is particularly interesting because we're still seeing all the effects of the pandemic on work and family.
So what's the takeaway here? What does all this mean for society?
I think if we zoom out, it really shows how much we need better workplace policies across the board, things like parental leave for both moms and dads, that's easy to get affordable, high-quality childcare and flexible work arrangements. If we want people to have choices, to build their careers and also have families without hitting a wall.
It's not just about individual choices, it's about how workplaces are structured.
Exactly, and we can't forget about tackling those deep-rooted gender stereotypes and expectations. We need to build environments where no one feels bad about wanting to be involved in family life, and where both men and women have real opportunities to do that without hurting their careers.
And just to be clear, this whole deep dive is based on P.N. Cohen's analysis of data from the American Community Survey from 2021 to 2023, which we got from ipus.org. And remember, the size of those bubbles on the chart shows how many people are in each job. And that weighted median spline shows the overall trend based on how big each job category is.
Right.
And just to add to that, the study looked at the most recent job for women who were unemployed, and they left out 19 really small occupations, so the data would be more reliable.
It's amazing, right? When you have these big data studies, it lets you see these patterns so clearly. It goes beyond individual stories and shows these systemic trends and how work and family are connected.
Well, this deep dive into, gender and jobs and birth rates has given us a lot to chew on.
It really has, and it brings up this question for everyone listening. Given all these patterns, what specific changes at work, or even just in how we think about gender roles, do you think would make the biggest difference in creating a world where people have more support for their family choices, no matter what kind of job they have?
That's a great thought to leave everyone with. What concrete steps can we take? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
See ya.